Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8. Several more connections here to the Messianic secret. Another odd healing from Jesus. And the first time that the disciples really get the picture and say something that's profound is also found in this chapter. We're going to start in verse 22. Mark 8, beginning in verse 22. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes, put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." So, a few things from that little section. First of all, Bethsaida is actually where Peter and Andrew were born. That's their hometown. During the ministry of Jesus, of course, they lived at Capernaum. Both of these little towns were close to the lake, and they were fishing villages. So the fact that they moved from Bethsaida to Capernaum was a little larger town, had a few more amenities, probably a little easier to sell whatever it was that they were catching. And they teamed up with James and John Zebedee and their dad. So maybe for all those reasons they went to Capernaum. And Capernaum ends up being, ground zero for a lot of miracles, for a lot of the things that Jesus did. They always seem to go back to Capernaum. But Bethsaida actually means the house of fish. So you can imagine that there was a fishing camp in Bethsaida. One of our favorite places on the planet started out as a fishing village down at Rockport. If you've never been to Rockport or that area, I would encourage you to go. It's a beautiful place. Started out as a Vietnamese fishing village years and years ago. Jesus does, again, kind of an odd miracle, at least to my way of thinking. He spits in the man's eyes. This is not the only healing that Jesus does using spit. There are actually two more. The other one, one of the other ones has to do with healing a man born blind. You remember that one? John chapter 9, he spits on the ground and he makes mud out of the spit. He puts it in the man's eyes and tells him to go wash his face in the pool of Siloam, which means the pool where you're being sent. Go wash it in the pool called Sent. Man goes, washes his face, and he comes back. Then we have one that we've already looked at in Mark, where the guy is deaf and speech impaired, and he spits on his fingers and touches the guy's tongue. And when he touches the guy's tongue with his spittle, then the guy's tongue is loosed, puts his fingers in the guy's ears and says, "Ephatha, be loosed." The guy can hear and he can speak. So this is the third. There's only three of them. In this one, it doesn't have the mud. It just has the spit. So it's kind of a combination of the other two. He spits in his eyes. I don't know whether he spit directly or whether he spit on his fingers and put his fingers in his eyes. Doesn't matter to me either way. Both ways are odd to me that that's the way that he did it. The other oddity, of course, is that this is the only healing in the New Testament where we have halfway healing. Jesus says, "Can you see now?" And the guy says, "Well, I see people, but they look like trees." So basically, Jesus got him from being totally blind to being where I am when I wake up in the morning. Right? Before the glasses go on, that's about where the guy was after the first healing. Why? You don't want to end up saying, well, Jesus couldn't get the job done. So he tried and it didn't work out, so he had to try again, had to give him a double dose of healing before he was healed. There's no indication that that's the case. Some commentators think that Jesus is teaching a lesson that he's going to follow up on with his disciples. Right? It took 2 times to get this guy where he could see. Do you remember the last question that Jesus asked his disciples before we get to this section? He quotes from Isaiah, Are you those that seeing still cannot see, and hearing still cannot hear? And so the next thing we have Mark telling us about is a guy who is healed of his blindness, but he's healed in degrees. If nothing else, the disciples are eventually healed of their spiritual blindness, but it happens in degrees. They don't wake up one morning and suddenly they understand everything they need to understand about Jesus. And we'll see that in the very next section. They get some things right, say some profound things, and then say some really stupid things right behind it. So Jesus heals the guy, and when the guy is able to see completely, then the Messianic secret kicks in. Jesus doesn't want him to go talk about it in the village, and he sends him home but says, don't even go to the village. Go around the village. Don't go back where we were before. He takes him outside the village by himself to heal him, and then he sends him home by a different route so the rest of the people don't see him going home. So again, the Messianic secret is fully in evidence here. All right, look at the next section, verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others say one of the prophets." "What about you?" he asked. "Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You're the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about them. Now, Mark doesn't report all of the passage that we have in Matthew. Did you notice some of the things that were not there? Okay. Peter says, "We know who you are. You're the Christ, the Son of God." In Matthew, Jesus says, "Well, blessed are you, Simon, son of John. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Mark doesn't give us all of that. I don't know why. But remember, Mark is working in close concert with the Apostle Peter when he writes this. It may be that Peter didn't want Mark to include that part. It's a little self-aggrandizing, to write that kind of thing about yourself. But we don't know particularly why Mark chooses to leave this out. But he does include another Messianic secret. Don't tell anybody. In Matthew, this confession happens in chapter 16. In chapter 17, we have the transfiguration. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain and is transfigured in front of them. And he tells them, don't tell anybody. Right? So you've got 3 of the 12 who have the biggest secret you can imagine. They've seen Moses and Elijah on the mountain. They're not supposed to tell anybody. But Jesus keeps enacting this Messianic secret. Don't tell everything you know. Keep the secret. And so hopefully that's what they did. The problem comes in not with them beginning to understand that he's Messiah, but beginning to understand what that means. To them, the idea that he was Messiah meant something like conquering hero, right? At some point, he's going to get rid of Herod. The Romans are going to get run out of town, and Israel will be back to being Israel, and Jesus will be her king. And they would ask him questions like, well, when you come into your kingdom, can I sit on your right and my brother sit on your left? Right? Can we have positions of authority when you come into your kingdom? And Jesus would say, well, that's not up to me. That's up to my Father in heaven to make those kinds of decisions. But they don't understand how he has to do that approach to becoming the king. For them, it's all earthly. It's all a power play. It's a coup. And Jesus will start trying to explain to them the difference between what they see in Messiah and what God's really going to do through Messiah. So what some scholars call this is the suffering Messiah. They've got to learn that Messiah has to suffer. So look at verse 31. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Now, let me ask you, how specific is that? That's pretty specific, right? Long before he was arrested, long before he was tried and executed, Jesus was telling them all the details in advance. They don't want to hear it. Now, this is not the storyline that they had imagined. Growing up as little boys in Bethsaida, growing up as little boys in Capernaum in that area, when they talked about Messiah is coming, there was never a discussion of Messiah is going to come and get crucified. So this doesn't match at all with everything they always thought was true. Verse 32, he spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Now in Matthew, the conversation is completely between Peter and Jesus. In Mark, there's a little bit more of a communal thing going on. Peter is the spokesperson, but when Jesus turns around, he looks at his disciples and says to Peter. So he rebukes Peter in front of the whole group. Can you think of another time that Peter was in public and got rebuked by somebody? When he was in Antioch and he was eating with Gentiles, and then folks from Jerusalem, from the household of James, came up for a visit. He stopped eating with the Gentiles, would only eat with the Jews. Paul rebukes him to his face publicly in front of everybody and says, you're sinning. This whole idea that you've got going on is just wrong. And so he rebukes Peter to his face. So Peter had the high esteem of being rebuked directly by the Lord and by the Apostle Paul. So, and again, Peter's our guy, right? He's always trying so hard, and because he tries so hard, he makes more mistakes. We don't get a lot of information about James the Less, because James the Less kind of kept his mouth shut. He wasn't in the middle of all these discussions. But Peter gets rebuked right in the middle of the group of disciples. And did you notice that he calls him Satan? "Get behind me, Satan." Now, the two words that we run into, well, there's three, I guess. The three that we run into the most describing Satan are Beelzebub, which the Jews usually change to Beelzebul, which is the Lord of the Flies, okay, the Lord of the dung heap. Then you've got Satanas, Satan, which is the accuser, the one who is in charge of bringing the case against someone. And then Diabolu, the devil, the liar. Right? So Jesus chooses to call Peter Satan, the accuser, the one who's trying to change the case, trying to make things, trying to rearrange the way things are supposed to be in favor of something else. And so he just says, you get behind me. You're not thinking about heavenly things. You're thinking about earthly things. Is that Peter's fault? No. I mean, he's not listening carefully to what Jesus is saying. He's not, but how could he? We've got such an advantage looking back through 2,000 years of history. We know all about the death, burial, and resurrection. It's the cornerstone of our faith. Peter knew nothing about the death, burial, and resurrection. There was no way for him to know it yet. And so we've got to cut him a little bit of slack, but Jesus rebuked him publicly for trying to get in the way of what God was doing just because Peter didn't understand what God was doing. All right, the last little section in chapter 8 is even more pointed. Verse 34, he called the crowd to him along with his disciples. And he said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it." And so now he's even more specific. Not just that he's going to be killed, not just that he is a suffering Messiah, but he's going to die on a cross, and that people who follow after him need to be willing to take up the cross and follow him. If you're taking up a cross, following a guy who's carrying a cross, where are you going? You're going to get crucified. Right? So this isn't just some euphemism, just some, you be in it, wholeheartedly, don't give up the faith, be faithful, whatever. This is, if you follow me, I'm going to take my cross, and you're going to take your cross, and we're going to die. That's what this faith is about. When you look at the 12 apostles, 0 died from old age, I think. John may have died of old age. He was up in his 90s. They may have just let him die. But the rest of them are martyred. What do you do if you're that group of men and you're looking back 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later, and you're going, oh, I remember when Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, you've got to take up your cross and follow me. That's what he meant, right? It wasn't a euphemism. It wasn't just a nice sermon topic. It was a real life, real death kind of thing. Verse 36, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world but forfeit their soul? What can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world but forfeit their soul? You see, it's not about me getting power. It's not about me being the leader of a coup that's going to take over Israel, that's going to defeat Rome. If it was just about physical power, we could do it that way. But what if you lose your soul? Having all of these things, what good is that if you lose your soul? And you look at some of the people that are in the news today who have amassed tremendous amounts of wealth, but you wonder about their spiritual state. Right? One individual's been in the news all week, this last week, been brought to trial or been arraigned and is being brought to trial for all kinds of horrible accusations. Right? If they're true, how much more degraded could your soul, could your spirit be? But rich, crazy rich. And Jesus says, well, what good does it do you if you gain the whole world, but you lose your soul? In another place, he says, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to enter into heaven. Wealth gets in our way sometimes, and the pursuit of wealth gets in our way sometimes. These disciples were thinking in terms of, one of these days, if I follow Jesus, I'll be the upper 1%. Right? I'll be sitting on the right hand of the king. I'll have whatever I want. I'll be powerful, and I'll be rich, and I'll be blessed. And Jesus says, no, that's not where we're headed. We're headed for, I'm going to take my cross, and you're going to take your cross, and we're going to go get killed because our souls are more important than our finances. And that's a difficult lesson for all of us to learn. And he follows that up with, if you're ashamed of me, then I'm ashamed of you. Right? Another passage says, if you confess me before man, I will confess you before my Father. And if you deny me before man, I will deny you before my Father. So very pointed statements to his disciples who are in that. I'm thinking of a washing machine, right? And you're in there and it's agitating. They're just being agitated, moved around, washed over, covered up. And they're never quite sure at any moment exactly what's going on. But they're trying so hard to figure it out. They're trying to protect Jesus and what they think Jesus should be. And Jesus is having to correct them even for trying to protect him. He's got to reteach and help them understand that his mission is to be not just Messiah, but to be the suffering Messiah that's going to bring life for all of those who follow him. Any questions or thoughts about those? You see how they kind of fit together? Mark likes to put accounts together that kind of fit. And so those three, it just flows nicely together as the disciples are learning new things as they go.